Before we begin with our final Blue Box seminar of fall 2021, I would like to acknowledge that the territory in which many of us are gathering as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the Newfoundland Island as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk in the Mi'kmaq. I would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and the Nunatuhavut, and the Innu of Desinan and their ancestors as the original peoples of Labrador. Together we strive for respectful relationships with all peoples in this place as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation, and ultimately honor this beautiful land and its waters together. So thank you everybody for joining us for the final Blue Box of this term. So a wonderful Friday. Many of us are wrapping up classes in our different roles, which is exciting. I just finished mine today. So I'm a lot lighter than I normally am. But really happy to be here and spending this time with all of you. And we have a wonderful presentation by Kirsten in Exit Seminar.
Not on this computer.
Oh, okay. So just with that, I just want to thank everybody for a fun term and for Arn for allowing Ratana and me to organize the Blue Box. It was sure a lot of fun to do and to interact a bit more with everybody in the department. So without further ado, Carissa to introduce our speaker today.
All right, thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be able to introduce Kirsten for her PhD research seminar. And it's awesome to see how many current and former Northern Edge Labbers, hi Leah, hi Stella and Lucas, are here. So it is our tradition in geography for supervisors to introduce their students. And this is the only time that we get to have this moment of awkward embarrassment. And Katie, so bear with me, settle in, I'm gonna take a couple of minutes here, much to Kirsten's absolute nervousness. So when Kirsten first came to MUN following her Master's of Science at Laurier, I was starting a collaboration with someone that I saw as a freshly minted Master of Science who had spent a little bit of time working, but during her Master's had managed a series of really tough field summers in challenging conditions at a remote field camp, working on boreal forest fire questions in Northwest Territories with a huge team of some of the biggest names and biggest personalities in boreal forest research. So to have successfully navigated all of that, and she still wanted to do a PhD, told me that this kid had real grit and could handle anything that our research group might encounter. I mean, little did we know what was coming in 2020, but we started strong. So Kirsten and I started with many conversations about the challenges to predicting species range expansion in the subarctic, which somehow, somewhere led us to think, why don't we just measure everything? Everywhere, let's measure it everywhere. This is such a great idea, nothing could go wrong. And you know what, it was a really great idea. And Kirsten absolutely killed it with securing research funds for this giant project, managing the incredibly challenging logistics of setting up this long-term field experiment where I sort of parachuted in for a bit, but really on her own with the help of her lab mates and me occasionally over the phone, across a 1,200 kilometer latitudinal gradient stretching from Whitehorse, Yukon to Tuktoyaktuk, Northwest Territories, and measuring everything from soil microbes to large mammals. No big deal, just a real quick PhD, easy field experiment. Her sites were set, her data loggers and wildlife cameras were logging, her monthly measurements in person were planned, our 3 full field summers were laid out with specific measurements for specific taxa and processes happening at specific times. Enter the pandemic. And I'm going to be honest, Kirsten, I played it cool over Zoom, I think, but I wasn't really sure how this one was going to play out. A field season of uncertainty is challenging for any researcher, but particularly for a PhD student planning or any graduate student planning their major data collection year in the first months of the pandemic. Yet under that stress, Kirsten's character was really revealed. More important to Kirsten than the data she had planned to collect were the communities and people that she would need to come in contact with to conduct her field season. Under Kirsten's lead, we preemptively canceled the 2020 field season, regardless of whether Yukon and Northwest Territories and MUN opened up to research. Kirsten felt strongly that it was unethical to travel into the North under any possibility of acting as a vector for COVID-19, even though this meant losing an incredible amount of data and throwing a heck of a lot of planning out the window. I really can't emphasize enough how much of Kirsten's original project was lost when we canceled that field season. But I also think that I don't need to because of what she's done in the meantime, which needs no disclaimers of, well, it was supposed to be this. Through the pandemic, she's pivoted her research to be as relevant as it can be to the Vuntech Gwich'in of Northern Yukon, including securing grant funds as a co-PI for Vuntech Gwich'in-driven research questions, increasing the value of her research to the region immeasurably, research that Kirsten and labmate Carissa, just presented at Old Crow's Vuntech Gwich'in research gathering a few weeks ago. I'm almost done, I swear, Kirsten. It's almost over. Kirsten's accomplishments and achievements are incredible to the point that I cannot list them all here if I'm ever going to stop talking. Let me just tell you, this is one driven human. I particularly respect her effort to connect with youth. And just as a really good example of that, here in Newfoundland and Labrador, she independently applied for funds for a Forest School in a Box initiative that brought the documented benefits of nature-based forest school curriculum to primary school kids in rural areas, just for the heck of it. And she also just happened to have been named one of the top 25 environmentalists under 25 just a year or two ago. I'm certain that Kirsten is on a trajectory of a lifelong career in Northern research and conservation. She practices ethical, thoughtful research. She prompts lab discussions of reconciliation and science, and on her own initiative reaches out to rights holders and practitioners engaged in the regions she studies, many of whom are here today. She's a generous colleague, giving her time and resources to other grad students in our research group and departments. So congratulations, Kirsten. I know you're not done the PhD, but this is a giant step forward, and I really look forward to seeing what you do next. So that is very much so enough talking from me. And joining us now live from Whitehorse, Yukon, take it away, Kirsten.
Well, thank you very much for that effusive introduction. I really appreciate it. Okay, classic question. Can everybody see my screen? Great. Okay, thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm gonna share with you my PhD research thus far. And I wanna start off with my acknowledgements. I'm very grateful for all of these funders and all of these people who've helped me out so significantly over the years. I wouldn't be here without them. And I also want to acknowledge that all the research that I did took place on the traditional territories of the Vuntech Gwich'in and the Trondak Gwich'in. So I'm grateful for their ongoing support for allowing me to research there. And today I'm presenting from the traditional territories of the Tonquachin Council and the Kwammadun First Nation. So I'm very grateful to be here. In addition to all these funders and all these behind the scenes people, none of this research would be possible without any of the wonderful people who came to the field with me. I'm very grateful for all of their help over the years. And most of them are here today. So I guess that means that I wasn't too bad to work with in the field. Especially grateful for Lucas's supervisory skills. Bottom right-hand corner, probably one of my favorite field pictures ever. And as Carissa mentioned, things didn't go to plan in 2020. And so I'm forever indebted to Megan and Brett, and especially Charlie here, who went to all my sites in the Yukon in 2020 and downloaded some much needed data for me. So I'm very grateful to Megan for all of her help. So into the science. The Arctic is warming faster and to a greater degree than anywhere on the planet. We know this, and we know that it's happening. And when we think about how this is often portrayed on the landscape, we often think about sort of these large scale disturbances that happen. So we think about fires. Fires are happening more frequently. They're happening hotter. We're seeing them every year, and we're seeing them in places that we don't typically see them. we're also seeing large incidences of permafrost thaw. So this is Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories. This lady's house is perched right on the edge of the Arctic Ocean. It's underlain by permafrost. And as this permafrost is thawing, her house is literally about to fall into the ocean any storm now. And so these are sort of often the big sort of big disturbances that people think of when they think of climate change in the north. And we can consider these pulse disturbances. So they're things that happen once. There's a big change in how the landscape looks or how the processes happen afterwards. And in the Yukon, pulse disturbances, and not just the Yukon, you know, a lot of places in Northwest Boreal, really, pulse disturbances can be thought of in 3 main groups. So we've got wildfire, like I mentioned. So here's a wildfire map of the Yukon, and it shows the satellite derived predictions of how often we expect fires to come through. So different fire cycles in different area of the Yukon. And then the little symbols just represent where we have on the ground data showing where the fire, how quick the fires actually do come through. We also have permafrost thaws, like I mentioned. So the whole of the Yukon is underlain by permafrost, ranges from continuous permafrost in the north. So approximately 100% is underlain by permafrost, to sporadic discontinuous in the south. And these permafrost thaw events can have huge implications on the landscape. We saw that lady's house in Tuktoyaktuk falling. It can have issues with the roads. When whole kind of slides slough off into rivers and oceans, it really has a huge impact on ecosystems. And then the third example that we have is forest pests, so insects and beetles and pathogens. And these aren't a huge problem in the Yukon right now, but as things start to warm up, we predict that they're going to be more of a problem as they come up from the south. They're already a big problem in Alberta and BC. And so we only really have one documented case of forest pests in the Yukon. That's in Kluane down here in the southwest corner of the Yukon. That's where this map is showing you here. And so everywhere in green is spruce forest that the beetle could have attacked, and everywhere in orange is where the beetle did attack. So it attacked a huge portion of the landscape, and there's huge ecological consequences as a result of that. But in addition to pulse disturbances, we also have press disturbances. So we can consider climate change a press. So it's just always there. It's a steady press. It's just changing things bit by bit, but it's this kind of constant chronic pressure that is on the landscape. And one of the places that we tend to see the results of the press of climate change is in vegetation communities. So Yukon is a fascinating complex of biomes. We have everything here ranging from mountaintops and valleys to large expanses of dense forest and sparse forest. We've got tundra, we've got grassland. There's really is just like a little bit of everything and a little bit of everything in between. And so the press of climate change with changing weather and changing weather patterns or changing climate patterns, we might expect to see many of these ecosystems changing in their vegetation composition, whether that's big dramatic changes in terms of it's now forested where it wasn't forested before, or whether it's sort of slightly more subtle changes like a change in the understory vegetation community. All these things are very possible. And so when we're considering all the vegetation communities and the pulse disturbances and chronic presses, we wanted to know, how have the vegetation communities in the Yukon already started responding to both the presses and the pulses of climate change? And what changes have been documented on the landscape? Like, what do we already know for sure is happening here? How do I change my slides? So to answer these questions, we did a literature review of the Yukon using the bioclimate framework laid out by Environment Yukon. So the bioclimate framework just separates the Yukon into these different bioclimate zones based on their regional climate, their vegetation, and their soil development. So we've got boreal bioclimate zones in the south, subarctic ones kind of in the north central Yukon there, and then in the north we have tundra sites, or tundra bioclimate zones, sorry. And so we did a big literature review, and we found only 29 studies that documented vegetation change throughout the Yukon. So we found 29 studies that said, after a fire, this is what the vegetation does, or as things start to warm, this is what the vegetation is doing. And so we acknowledge that we didn't use any local or traditional knowledge in this research, mainly due to logistical constraints, and COVID also played a factor in that. But we recognize that including those forms of knowledge would have been very beneficial. And so when we look at this, we see there's definitely an uneven distribution of the studies. There's obviously 14 studies in the boreal low, and a lot of them are also in the boreal high. So southern Yukon, places where people tend to live. But if we look at sort of north central Yukon there in the pink and in the orange, we see that there's only 4 studies there total. So that's a huge area of land that's quite understudied. And to give you context of how big this area is, this pink and red area is about the size of the island of Newfoundland. And we only have 4 studies documenting all of the responses of climate change in that area. And this area shouldn't be thought of as kind of a big expanse of the sameness, because it's very different as you go from the southern part of this area to the northern part of this area. So the southern part is forested, it's got big trees, everything's pretty productive. And then as you go further north, you get to the northern end of this, these bioclimate zones, we're into tundra. So there's no trees, lots of grassland. So it's a very big area, and we don't really know how it's responding to change. And so as a result of our literature review, we highlighted 30 research gaps about what needs to be figured out next and addressed next in understanding Yukon's response to climate change. I'm not going to step you through all 30. We'd be here for a long time. You can read our hopefully upcoming paper about that, but I do want to just chat about a couple of them that I've already kind of mentioned. So this is an example of a permafrost thaw feature. So the permafrost is thawed, and this whole sort of side of the hill slope has sloughed off into the river there. And you can see that it's pretty dominated by mineral soil, and this is an excellent place for vegetation to establish. And it's really important to understand when the vegetation does establish on top of these new seedbeds, what kind of vegetation is it? Is it just vegetation that's just there and then it's something else is gonna come in its place? Or is it sort of more of a predictable pattern of succession? Can we predict with quite a lot of confidence that it's going to be these species for 30 years, and then there'll be a successional shift into another set of species, and then another successional shift? Really, what is going on here, and what is the environment going to look like in the long term? Another question that we wanted to ask and that we think should be addressed is, what are the impacts of all of these dead trees from spruce bark beetle on the fire risk? So like I said, spruce bark beetle can destroy huge areas of forest and leave a lot of dead wood in its place, which is great for fire coming through. And then finally, also fire again. In other parts of the Arctic, in Alaska and in Siberia, we're seeing increased incidence of tundra fires. So these are places that don't typically burn, but we're starting to see them burn. And so starting to think about, is this happening in the Yukon? Where is it happening? And what do we know, again, about the post-fire vegetation patterns that are occurring as a result? So we've highlighted 30 gaps. Where do we go from here, and how do we use this knowledge? Firstly, Northern science and conservation are in huge periods of change. So here in the Yukon, Yukon University has recently been established, and the Yukon government science strategy is sort of in a period of revitalization. So we hope that by listing all of these research gaps, we can really provide some areas where people can research and look into future changes. Knowing how vegetation responds to climate change contributes to evidence-based decision-making. And evidence-based decision-making is really useful in a lot of different processes. So here in the Yukon, regional land use planning is ever ongoing, and they use evidence-based decision-making. We also need to know things like the carbon storage of ecosystem, planning for fire mitigation and suppression, and projecting the distribution of species. So all of the sort of evidence that we summarize and all the gaps that we're hoping to fill can really contribute to all these processes. And finally, while trends, the literature review showed us that trends in some climate parameters are pretty clear. So we know how forests are responding to drought throughout the Yukon. There is lots of variability across time and space, how different climate parameters are working, and really, what are some controls other than drought. And so that led us to thinking, what is controlling the composition of these communities aside from drought? And what about communities other than vegetation? And so to answer this, like Carissa alluded to, we set up a very large field experiment going from Stewart Crossing in central Yukon to just south of Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories. As a result of COVID, we did have to lose some of our sites. So we are down to 7 sites throughout central and northern Yukon. For those of you who haven't been there, I'm going to give you a brief run through of all my sites real quick. So it's important to note that these sites are sites that represent the local landscape. So if it's a forested site like this one, that's what the area in and around this site sort of looks like. So starting in the south here, we've got pretty dense black spruce forest with a thick moss understory. A little further north, trees are separating out a little bit in this area. Still got the moss understory. Up near Dawson, again, we're still forested. Go north of Dawson and north of Tombstone Territorial Park, we're into the tundra, the treeless tundra. Going into Oglebay Mountains, we're back to forested. Again, dense black spruce, understory of moss and lichen. Moving on up to Eagle Plains, black spruce as far as the eye can see. And then just north of the Arctic Circle, we've moved into tundra completely. I'm not saying I have a favorite site, but if I had to pick one, it would be this one. So we've got all of our sites that we're asking all of these questions at. You'll notice it goes from red in the south to blue in the north. That's going to stay pretty consistent throughout the next part of this presentation. So we have all of these sites and we want to measure community composition. We're going to do that at a bunch of different trophic levels to see how different trophic levels are responding to changes. So first trophic level is large mammals, looking at which large mammals are at each site. So we have one trail camera for each site that takes pictures whenever anything walks past or whenever anything destroys anything, whatever comes first. So we have those data for about 3 years for each site. The next thing we wanted to look at was small mammals. So again, using another camera, this time baited with peanut butter, with the idea being that anytime a vole or a shrew comes through the site, we can see what is eating the peanut butter here. As a byproduct of this research, I learned that other things other than voles and shrews and humans like peanut butter. So this was a camera that unfortunately got a little chewed up and tossed around. But because there was a camera, we were able to see the little critter who got to it. So there was this hungry wolf looking for a peanut butter snack. And then there was also this black bear who really tossed around the camera. So despite these cool methods, but possibly because of the many disruptions experienced with all of these data are really difficult to use. So I'm not going to be talking about them a lot today. No peanut butter was ever eaten at the tundra sites, which is an interesting observation of itself. I have a lot of experience with removing moldy peanut butter, but we can't definitively say that there are no small mammals there. And then as for the other sites, there was a lot of squirrels, which isn't what we were interested in, and also obviously a lot of disruption. So that's going to be the end of the vole and shrew talk for today, but know that those data do exist in some format. The next thing that we wanted to look at was the invertebrate community, and specifically the spiders and the ground beetles. Spiders and ground beetles were selected because there's been a lot of work done on them in this area. So we had pitfall traps set up at every site. Thank you to everybody who donated me yogurt containers a couple years back. These were buried in the ground at all of the sites, and any little critter that ran along the ground fell into the yogurt container. And I separated them into spiders, ground beetles, and other stuff. And my identification skills were not up to the task. So I'm also forever indebted to Sarah Laboda and Chris Ernst, who identified all of these for me. So we have very detailed data about the spider and ground beetle communities at all of these sites. We also looked at the understory vegetation at every site, the vascular and the non-vascular. So we have all that data. And then possibly the most logistically challenging part of my PhD were these soil data that we wanted to gather. We wanted to look at the soil microbes and the soil fungus at each site. FedEx lost 2 full coolers of soil shipments. The third one successfully made it to Saskatoon, then COVID hit, and there was a national pipette shortage, which my samples were obviously very low on the priority list for. And so those data are, they're coming, they're working on it. They're in Saskatoon, but not gonna be talking about that today either. So when we talk about the environmental drivers of all of these communities, I think the obvious driver that comes to mind is latitude. So the latitude and species diversity relationship is one that is pretty well studied. It's generally well understood that as you go further north, species diversity, species richness decreases. But a couple of recent studies in the Arctic have shown that that's perhaps not always the case across all taxa. So for spiders throughout northern Yukon, there's no real relationship between spider diversity and latitude. And then in the Northwest Territories, we actually see that plant diversity increases with latitude. So keeping these two things in mind and really remembering that latitude is just a proxy. Latitude is just something that you can measure on a map. And so it's always considered a proxy for either air temperature or sunlight or some other factor there. We wanted to see, you know, what's happening for other taxa, because if these are the sort of patterns we're seeing for spiders and for plants, perhaps we might be seeing something else happen with all these other taxa. So obviously, in addition to latitude, we wanted to measure other things. So at every site, we're measuring air temperature, measured by that little doohickey in that orange box there. We're measuring snow depth and length of the snow season. Soil moisture was what I meant to say. Now snow depth, now soil temperature. Sorry, I measured a lot of things. Next up is decomposition speed, which we did through ordering a very specific tea bag, weighing it, burying it, weighing it again, and then using their sort of international standardized equation to see how fast the decomposition was at each site. We measured soil available nutrients, which many people will recognize these PRS probes for. So you put these in the ground for the period of a summer, and the little films in there measure which nutrients are available, send them off to Saskatoon for analysis, and you can get an understanding of what's in the soil at every site. And then finally, we also measured organic layer depth and depth to resistance. So to get into some of these numbers, for the purposes of this presentation, these graphs have just been simplified a little just so we can kind of see some of the bigger patterns on the landscape. And so of everything that we measured for large mammals, the only significant driver was air temperature. So sites with a higher air temperature had a greater large mammal diversity, and sites with a lower air temperature had a lower large mammal diversity. I wouldn't say this is a particularly surprising relationship, and it's definitely something that we would have predicted. But we can also see, based on the color of the points, where red is low latitude and blue is high latitude, that this really falls out along a latitudinal gradient, with lower latitude sites being warmer and having a greater large mammal diversity. So if none of the predictive variables that we measured were important, what else is driving or controlling these large mammal communities, or is it really just air temperature alone? And so we started thinking about what else is important to large mammals. And what we kept coming back to was the vegetation community. So animals need habitat, they need food. And so even though we measured vegetation community to see what drives it, it can also be a driver of large mammal communities. So if we look at the relationship between plant richness and large mammal diversity, it's really not what you would expect to see. So we're seeing more mammals where there's a less rich plant community, but that is happening at bungled that one. We're seeing more mammals where there's less rich plant community, but we're seeing higher plant richness at higher latitude. So that's complicated to say, but it's also not what we would have predicted. So yeah, the sort of conclusion for this section is that there's probably more to unpack there and more to look at, but it seems that at a landscape scale, air temperature and latitude are really the drivers of large mammal diversity. For the next couple of trophic levels for spiders and ground beetles and plants, we used NMDS, non-metric multidimensional scaling, to look at these data in multiple dimensions. So when you see an NMDS graph, it has points representing sites, and we interpret this by saying the points that are closer together. So for example, here, the square and the circle, those are more similar to each other than they are to the star. So the star is very different than the other two. The other thing that you can do with NMDS is overlay environmental variables. So here we can say that the circle and the square are similar to each other, and they both are driven by high air temperature, whereas the star is different and it's driven by high soil moisture. So if we look at some of the actual data, this is the NMDS for the plant or for the spider community. So the different colors, they represent the sites again. there's 2 dots or two representations of each site. We did it over 2 years. And so in cases where the 2 dots of the same color are close to each other, that means there's very little interannual variation. But if they're more spread out, there's more interannual variation. And on the left there, the blue and the yellow, those are squares. So those represent the 2 tundra sites, whereas everything else is circles. So that represents the forest sites. So what we can see from this is that the tundra sites are really kind of pulling out alone, and they are defined by high soil moisture, elevation, organic layer depth, and a longer snow cover. Whereas everything else kind of clumps on the right and is definitely defined by higher air temperature and soil temperatures, more sunlight. So there's a pretty strong latitudinal gradient here, with warmer colors being on the right, colder colors being on the left. We can look at the same thing with the ground beetles. And so in spiders, we're seeing less of a spread in general, but also less spread between years, whereas the ground beetle graph is pretty spread out. There's also less of a latitudinal pattern in the ground beetles than in the spiders. But in both groups, we're seeing the tundra sites, the blue sites and the yellow sites grouping together with the same drivers, even though they're in different orientations, that doesn't matter, but they're pulling out the same way. And so, you know, going back to the beginning of this chapter when I talked about how we had to ditch some sites in the NWT due to COVID, this site design was originally a little bit more balanced. We had more sites in the tundra, and so we really thought we'd be able to pull out how different patterns are happening in the tundra versus the forest. But when we had to lose the NWT, we lost a bunch of tundra sites. And so even though these tundra sites are pulling out, there's probably not enough power there to really sort of say anything. So we wanted to look at this analysis again without the tundra sites. So if we remove the tundra sites, we remove the blue and the yellow, we generally see the same patterns as before. Pretty low interannual variation in spiders. But now we can see these 2 higher latitude forested sites, they're grouping together. And these sites are defined by their deeper organic layer and their longer snow cover. We're still seeing an air temperature or latitude gradient, with the warmer sites generally being on one side of the graph. And they're overlaid, like I said, with environmental variables such as temperature and insolation. So things are looking a little clearer without the tundra sites, but we're still seeing this sort of latitude or air temperature gradient. We're also looking at plants through an NMDS lens. This is the same idea as before, but instead of points, the sites are represented by shapes. There's more repetition there. And so instead of a bunch of sites, everything that is at that one site is included, or instead of a bunch of points, sorry, everything at the one site is included in this little polygon. And so the bigger the polygon, the more spread there is within the site. The smaller the polygon means things are more similar across that site. So for example, the dark blue site's pretty small, so there's pretty consistent vegetation across all the repetitions at that site, whereas some of the other sites, the teal site's pretty big, things change across that site. And so similar to the beetles and spiders, we see that the 2 tundra sites are kind of grouping together with the same drivers as before. And we're also seeing the southern sites really grouping out on the right-hand side there. The other thing that we can do with NMDS is overlay the species, so we can see which plant species are occurring at these sites. And there's nothing super surprising going on here. So arboreal forest sites, they're pretty dominated by thick layers of pleurocarpus moss, Cladonia cladina lichens. We've got bunchberry or Cornus canadensis and twin flower Linnea borealis. And then in our tundra sites, we got a lot of shrubs, a lot of birch and salix shrubs, sedges and grasses, and bog rosemary or Andromeda paulifolia. So nothing super surprising here, but similar to the spiders and beetles, we wanted to see what it would look like if we got rid of the tundra sites. And so what we can see here is that the warmer sites are still pulling out on the right-hand side there, the more southern sites still driven by air temperature, et cetera, but we're seeing more separation between our 2 high latitude sites. So our teal site there is really driven by its soil moisture gradient, whereas the green site is more driven by its organic layer depth, elevation, et cetera. And we can again look at the vegetation community. So still pleurocarpus, et cetera, for the southern communities. But when we look at these 2 more northern forested sites, We see that they're dominated by things like crowberry or impetrum, northern Labrador tea, rhododendron tomentosum, horsetail, and Arctic rose. So these sort of species which are traditionally thought of as being like more high latitude or more or tree line sort of sites. So what did we learn? We learned that this data is a lot. There's a lot of data here. We're definitely not finished unpacking it all. But from the data that we have explored and from what we're seeing sort of at the moment is that there really is a strong gradient in community diversity and richness that's driven by latitude and or air temperature. So in the beginning of this section, I talked about wanting to really uncover what latitude was masking, but it seems that, at least for what we've done so far, it really is just latitude. There's a temperature and insolation gradient there too. Obviously, there's more work to be done here, like I said. And I think one of the things that we haven't done yet, but we're talking about post-thesis, not adding more to my current thesis, but we have all these very detailed data for the soil communities, for the spiders and for the ground beetles. And so really thinking about how we can sort of analyze that more in depth, probably with some of the experts, because I'm certainly no spider expert, but thinking about more community data driven papers with those sorts of things. And then finally, one of the big questions that I had when I started this chapter was, when we uncover this underlying driver that latitude is masking, is that something that is going to directly change with climate change? Or is it something that is probably not going to change super quickly? For example, if the underlying driver was something like organic layer depth, that's not something that we would expect to change super quickly with climate change. But we are seeing that there is an air temperature gradient, and that is something that we're expecting to change as a result of the chronic press of climate change. And so we may expect these communities and other ones to be influenced by the press of climate change. And so in addition to this press, when you have systems that are affected by, or communities that are affected by climate change, when you have systems that are influenced by air temperature, may be affected by the press of climate change, then when a pulse disturbance comes through, even though the system is seemingly quite resilient, we may expect to see rapid change. So let's look at an example of that after I take a sip of water. Everyone else can stretch. So what are the ecological responses to compounding threats? And what happens when we have more than one press or pulse disturbance? Based on our knowledge of climate change and subarctic ecosystems, we can come up with a set of predictions about how an ecosystem will respond to compounding threats. And we can apply these to any particular place throughout the subarctic that has or continues to have multiple threats. And then finally, we can synthesize what we know about that place and highlight the important areas of knowledge, but also the important research gaps. So here's the predictions that we came up with. So first, if climate change remains unchecked, then we would predict that patterns and processes such as altered precipitation, drought, CO2 fertilization will dominate. In regions where wildfire is the dominant disturbance, then the frequency, severity, and intensity of wildfires will continue to increase. And there will also be an increase in other natural disturbances such as pests, insects, pathogens, and really some of these disturbances like insects and pathogens, if they're able to get into a system, they really do have the ability to spread quite quickly. So the second prediction is that if there are no directed revegetation efforts, then industrial activity will reduce the resilience of the system, possibly shifting it into a new trajectory or state with landscape-wide consequences. And then finally, if climate change and industrial activity combine, new disturbances and competitors are likely to be introduced to the region. So then the next step of this is to apply these predictions to a location. So we picked the Eagle Plains Basin in northern Yukon, highlighted in green here. Eagle Plains is within the territory of the Vuntut Gwitchin, and it's the traditional homelands of the Dagu Gwitchin. And so for this portion of the research, we're collaborating with the Fish and Wildlife Department and the Heritage Department at Vuntut-Gwitchin government to really understand how these compounding influences, climate change, industrial disturbances, are going to affect what's historically been a relatively resilient system and what historically and currently is a very important place to the Vuntut-Gwitchin. Eagle Plains is also an important place because it's the wintering habitat of the porcupine caribou herd. And so there's a lot of ecological and cultural reasons to conserve this area and make sure that the caribou and their habitat are protected. So Eagle Plains is, it's in the boreal forest. It is continuous black spruce as far as I can see. It's, they're very, very uniform communities, a lot of black spruce. And as a result of there being these kind of these black spruce seas, it's also dominated by a natural cycle of wildfire. So every 80 to 150 years, wildfire comes through the system. The plants there are adapted to it. The black spruce especially require the fire to release their cones, or release their seeds from their cones rather, and the regeneration cycle starts all over again. But as things are starting to heat up globally, we're seeing that fire cycles are kind of coming through either quicker than they're expected in different places that they're expected. And so what do we know about wildfire and climate change in Eagle Plains? Well, we know based on Carissa's PhD research that when a fire comes through quicker than expected, in Eagle Plains, this happened after 15 years. The trees were not ecologically mature when they burned the second time. And so there was regeneration failure. You have areas that were black spruce, like the top picture there. They should be regenerating to that same sort of picture. But we found that they're not regenerating to that. They're regenerating to either shrublands or grasslands. And when we have this huge change in ecosystem, it's not just that it changes from trees to shrubs, but all the other associated vegetation changes. The animals are going to change how they use the landscapes, and everything is going to change. And so this is one of the threats that we're seeing within Eagle Plains. Eagle Plains also has a pretty rich history of industrial disturbances. So exploration began in the area in 1957 and has basically been on and off since then. And Eagle Plains is home to one of the largest untouched oil and gas reserves in the Yukon. There's a great Narwhal article about it if anyone wants to read more. But the amount of disturbance that's already occurred in Eagle Plains has already surpassed the cautionary threshold that the regional land use plan has set up. And so in addition to fire, we have all of these other disturbances that we need to understand how the system is responding. So in some ways, they're kind of similar to fire. It results in the loss of trees, but in other ways, it's different because, as I mentioned, when the fire comes through, the seed is released and everything is primed to regenerate. In these sorts of situations, the trees are just removed. There's no natural or man-made seed addition there. So within Eagle Plains, sort of despite all this industrial presence, there's only really been one study of the recovery of vegetation after industrial disturbance. And it's kind of a preliminary study, but it gives us some interesting ideas about what may or may not happen to the vegetation after the disturbance. And really what they found from this, this study was that a road or a path that was created by the disturbance and was only used a couple of times, there's pretty good recovery there. Recovery happened to species that we would expect, all these sort of boreal forest black spruce species. But when disturbance was greater, when there were seismic lines that were used for a lot of exploration or roads that were used regularly, pads and wells that had no active reclamation, these were regenerating mainly as shrub species. And again, similar to the trajectories that we see with fire, if they're just regenerating to shrub species and those associated vegetation, then the whole vegetation community is likely to change. So this study happened in the 2000s, 2010s, and there hasn't been any follow-up studies since then. And so sort of more detailed understanding of the recovery trajectories are kind of unknown. And so for the industrial disturbances, the sort of dearth of data there makes it really hard to estimate how the area is going to respond to compounding threats. understanding how the vegetation is going to recover. And so we're really left relying on other areas, whether that's Alaska, which has similar vegetation composition, similar permafrost situation, and also has industrial activity there, or whether that's further south in Canada, like Alberta, where there has obviously been a lot of industrial activity, but there's also been sort of a corresponding relative amount of research and understanding into how the vegetation is recovering there. So we're really left, like I said, relying on understanding from other systems to think about how these systems in Eagle Plains are going to recover. And then we also have the question of what happens when we have both fire and industrial activity. So as things are literally heating up in Eagle Plains and the industrial activity is heating up, it's becoming more, and there are plans for more in the future. There's really the need for an understanding of the competing pressures in Eagle Plains. And this overlap of pressures and threats is something that we have no baseline for in this particular place. So again, we have to draw on our understanding from other locations to see what is happening. So this research in Eagle Plains is ongoing, and we are working, like I said, with the Funtuck-Witchin to see what we can figure out about what is happening. But what we're finding is that for a lot of these threats and predictions, we don't really have enough data about the area to make reliable estimates about how things will change. And so this is formed into the beginning of a synthesis about what we definitely know in the region and a corresponding summary of the important research gaps. And so I think the main conclusion from this research so far, and probably the ongoing conclusion, is that really the disturbance effects are going to dwarf the effects of the climate change alone in terms of shaping the trajectories of the ecosystem. But we really need some, more on the ground data for that to really understand that better. So to summarize everything that I have talked about, the Yukon Northwest Boreal is a region of the Earth that has the most intense warming. We're also experiencing altered disturbance regimes and increased industrial pressures here. So through this research, we've documented changes across scales. And in some cases, we can really predict the outcomes. We know what is happening, what is likely to happen. In other cases, we're pretty data deficient. But also in some cases, we predict unprecedented communities or outcomes. And so it's important to really understand exactly what is going on in these systems, what changes we think are going to continue to happen, et cetera. And so with that, I will leave you with this very curious and destructive bear. And if anyone has questions, I think we have time for some.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kirsten, for a fantastic exit seminar presentation. We do indeed have about 10 minutes for questions. Is there anybody that would like to get us going? Or reflections? They don't have to be questions.
Hi, Kirsten. My name is Toby. Good presentation, by the way. I was just curious about the tundra side. Some of the effect that you found, are they limiting factor or are they promoting vegetation there? So what direction are they going?
Sorry, the limiting factor for which part?
Yeah, so I saw some of the tundra site that you were talking about. They're kind of clustered together, and then you found that they are being driven by organic layers, depth, and so on. So is that in a positive direction or a negative direction?
Oh, gotcha. Let me flip back to that slide because I can't remember. So for the plant communities, that's the community you're asking about, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So for plant communities, we're having thicker organic layer depths for the tundra sites. And then when we remove the tundra sites, there's thickest organic layer depth at one of these kind of high latitude sites, this green site, but it also corresponds with some of the more southern sites.
Yeah, I guess my question is, are they in positive direction or negative direction? Are they driving, so does that mean that increase in organic layer is causing increase in vegetation abundance or something like that?
It's not, yeah, so it's increase in organic layer depth is sort of defining that community as a whole. Right. So when you add on the plant species, those are the sort of plant species that we're associating with the communities that have deeper organic layer depth, et cetera.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Julie.
Hey, Kirsten. I think you're simply the best.
Thanks.
I have a question that could be described as a typical Julie question, because I think you intimately know just how much I don't understand your research. If there was like 1 to 3 things you wanted the average person to know about your like PhD story, what would that be? Also, 30 research gaps is crazy, and that blew my mind when you talked about that at the start. But answer that first question.
What 3 things would I want people to know? Oh God.
It doesn't have to be 3, it could be 1. It could be half of 1.
I guess it's not really about my research, but that the landscape is changing. Things are like the plant communities, animal communities, et cetera, are being impacted so quickly and so dramatically by climate change that it's important we got to do something.
You did it. That's the thing. Thanks, Kirsten.
Thanks, Julie.
Katie Goodwin.
Hi, Kirsten. First of all, that was an amazing talk. It's really cool to see everything you've done and some super valuable findings that are super relevant to the people of the Yukon. So that's really cool. I had a question about your trail cameras and your large mammal surveys. I think you mentioned that the plots you're looking at was looking at species richness of large mammals. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. I was just curious if there's any trends in like the frequency that animals came by, like insights, for example, where there's just like maybe one or like low species richness. Were they coming by a lot and you're seeing a lot of that one species? Or like, was there any elevation gradient in like the amount of activity of herbivores triggering the cameras or mammals triggering the cameras?
So those data were really overrun by squirrels and hares. And so I had a hard time trying to figure out, how do I deal with those? Because they basically, you would be completely ignoring everything else if you counted every time a squirrel came past. So on my large mammal data and my graphs there, the y-axis is average species richness per week, which is what I'm told camera trap people use a lot. And so you divide your data into 7-day chunks. And basically, if a squirrel comes past 100 times in 7 days, it just counts as once. But if a grizzly bear comes past once in 7 days, it still counts as once. And so then I averaged it out that way. So yeah, that's what the camera trap folks said I should do. And so that's how I eliminated some of those noise in my data.
So we have a question from Poppy in the chat. Is there anyone looking at, or did you consider distance to coast as a potential driver of changes in biodiversity across different trophic levels?
No, I did not, Poppy, ocean scientist. But thank you for that comment. That's not something, nope, never crossed my mind. I'll look into that. Thanks, Poppy.
Megan Hornseth.
Hi, Kirsten. That's a great presentation, and it's awesome to have seen your sites last year and then be able to see everything that's come out of them. Well, I guess I have 2 questions, but the first one, looking at the large mammal distribution, I think if I caught it right, you actually saw an increase in richness as you went north in latitude. Is that right?
Increase, no, increase in richness further south.
Okay.
I can share my screen again.
Because I'm interested in, like, that's, you know, that's what we would expect in terms of latitudinal gradients, but there's also such a big difference in terms of disturbance and access. And I'm curious if you considered looking at anything along those lines, whether there was a relationship that way.
Sorry, I was fiddling with my screen. A relationship between what?
Well, because in the more southern sites, you'd have more access and disturbance, but you still saw that increase in richness. And I'm just curious if there was any role of that, or if you looked at disturbance at all in relation to large mammal richness.
No, I didn't. You know, when I was originally selecting all the sites, they're all supposed to be sort of like similar distance off the highway, no evidence of human disturbance, etc. But in terms of actual sort of footprints and stuff, no, I didn't look at that.
Okay. And then I guess my other question was digging in a little bit more to your Eagle Plains site and the consideration of the cumulative effects of disturbance and climate change there. Recognizing that that's a challenging site to access, there's a lot going on in that area. What would be like your dream for trying to look at how to tease apart more of the impacts on that? If you had to like pick one or two things to really focus on in that area.
I think one of the big things is understanding the recovery of the vegetation after industrial disturbances. Like I said, there is that one study. It's great. I don't want to disparage that study. It's not particularly in depth and there hasn't been any follow-up. So it'd be really great to know. And I also don't like the vegetation data is not particularly in depth. So it would be great to have a better idea because we do have the data for the fire sites. So we can really say, you know, after 5 years, these species are here. After 15 years, these species are here. So it'd be great to have comparable information about the industrial disturbances. And then if there was crossover between fire and industrial disturbance, looking at how that is influencing the landscape. Those would be sort of my two go-tos there, I think. And I think it's an interesting place because Vuntagwitchin is super interested in Eagle Plains as a whole. And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting place to ask those kind of questions.
Definitely. Also with the long history of disturbance there.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a good, a key gap, I would say, in the cumulative effects world. So thanks.
Thank you.
Crystal, the wonderful Crystal.
Hi, Kirsten. I just wanted to applaud you. Where are you? There you are. Applaud you for all of your work so far and all of your excellent collaborations and the effort that you've had to go through and endure a field season during pandemic. So I just wanted to commend you on that. And then I wanted to ask a thought-provoking comment in reflection to your response to Poppy and in what would be the one kind of key message. And you highlighted the recognition of things are shifting, things are changing in the Yukon. Now that you're here in the Yukon and you're kind of immersed in the culture a bit more, and with your future work, I'm curious to how you would address that in terms of maybe management recommendations coming from your PhD work.
I don't know how to answer that. I think there's a lot of baseline stuff that needs to be done in the Yukon. And I think like the list of 30 recommendations that we listed in our paper, a lot of that is sort of very on the ground, very sort of fundamental data gathering. So I think a lot of that I don't know, you've thrown me with that question. I could get back to you with a better answer, but yeah, I think I think there needs to be sort of large scale sort of thinking about where we need to protect and which areas are really threatened, and management decisions about what we're going to protect and conserve going forward, and how we can do that sort of now while things are, before climate change gets any worse and before there are greater disturbances. And then also thinking about some of the sort of projects, et cetera, that are in review right now, whether it's in YESUB or whatever it may be, and thinking about the influences that they're really going to have on the landscape.
Thank you for responding.
Thanks.
Well, we've reached our time here. I thank you so much for joining us today, and to Kirsten, a big congratulations and thank you for a wonderful presentation and discussion. I'm going to leave this link open for a little bit for those of you that might want to continue chatting, but I wish you a wonderful finish to your respective Decembers and great holidays. Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Hey, Kristen, just as your committee member, wanted to say congratulations.
Thanks, Yolanda. Aaron and Bruce, I have a couple minutes if you guys have questions that you wanted to ask.
Sure. Wow. There was just one thing that was mentioned by the somebody earlier about distance from ocean. Mm-hmm. And there was a recent thing that came out in Nature which looked at the drivers of biodiversity. I don't know if you've seen that, but they basically mapped where the biodiversity hotspots were. So I just, I've got it on my screen right now, but I don't know how to share it. But what the whole concept that biodiversity declines as you head north doesn't really work all that well when you get into areas like Beringia, because so the biodiversity hotspots in especially the north, but in Canada are basically the west is more diverse than the east. And so my question was, did you look at whether distance from unglaciated areas affected the biodiversity richness?
Nope, I did not. That's another good point. Getting all these things to throw into my models here. Thanks. No, that's a great idea, because I mean, yeah, the glaciation in Beringia and stuff obviously plays a big role in all sorts of things. So
there was a question on the chat here. I don't want to lose track of it, and the person who asked it is still here. Did you look at potential for ecotone shifts between your sites?
Like whether an ecotone shift was actually happening?
Could the person who asked that clarify?
Hey, yeah, this is Chris. Hi. Yeah, I was just curious. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious because it's really nice talk, by the way. Got to start with that. But the way that your sites were arranged, you know, over such massive distances, and obviously, you know, it made total sense. But it also made me wonder a little bit about what happens between them, and you know, not just any old ecotone, but I'm sort of thinking about, because a lot of times people look at this and they're really thinking about those edges, and you have this sort of more of a hopscotch going through, which makes sense because you have such a large area. But I wondered if, in thinking about these discrete sites, if you also thought about the edges between them and if there was more information there.
Yeah, I think other folks in our lab, Lucas and Katie are both here. They can, they both did work on the edge. They both they both had study sites that were at the transition between one ecotone to the next. So the answer is no. I personally didn't look at it, but we do sort of like within our lab have people looking at how things are changing, how growing conditions are changing, how environmental conditions are changing as you go over the ecotone, as you go from the forest to the tundra. So I didn't look at that directly, but people are for sure.
Aaron waited patiently to ask. Aaron.
I somewhat patiently, yes. It only looks like that on Zoom. Kirsten, great to see this. Well done.
Thank you.
I am, as you may have been recently, reading the Dawson Regional Land Use Plan. Makes for great bedtime reading for folks who haven't seen it yet. And one of the things that struck me when I was in the Yukon with you a couple of years ago is fire. You know, a lot of stuff that I hadn't thought about in quite that way. So my question is, with things like these big draft regional land use plannings that are about industrial development, about conservation, are often predicated on the idea that the future is going to be like the present or the past. So specifically about fire, what do you think is most misunderstood by people about fire in that area? What do we need to be putting in? What does your research show about these kind of disturbances, composition across big areas that's not well reflected as people talk about or plan for these areas?
Oh, everyone's just bringing the hard questions today.
We're taking notes. We need you to help us do our work.
I think it's I don't know if it's something that's not well understood or it's just something that we don't sort of think about as often, but I think after there is a fire, the timeline to recovery, and we could define recovery in a bunch of different ways, but the timeline between what the forest looks or the system looks like pre-fire, the amount of time, by Lucas, the amount of time that it takes to get from sort of that intact forest with all of these late stage vegetation communities to getting back to there again is a long time. You know, a lot of the caribou work shows how long it takes for the caribou to come back to use these areas after disturbance because of lichen regeneration. And sorry, I got carried away with my thought train there. Yeah, so thinking about how long it takes for the system to recover, what's going to happen in the meantime, and what processes are going to be influenced. You know, if this area burns and so it's sort of out of commission for the next 50, 60, 80, 200 years, what does that mean for the surrounding areas? What does that mean for the animal land use, industrial land use, et cetera? Yeah, so really just the sort of timelines post-disturbance, I think.
Yeah, thanks. That's good. And I see that Crystal's put a comment in the chat too. Like, this is live stuff people are talking about. This is applied, applied science. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a super important and relevant science commentary here. That is, do you see that in Newfoundland, it's pitch black out? And that all of you Yukon, British Columbia, Alberta folks, I see that light coming through your windows.
It's pretty gray here today. It's kind of like Newfoundland.
Longitudinal gradients happening here. Awesome talk also, Kirsten. Well done.
Thank you.
But it's only been light for 2 hours. Just to let you, and it's going to be dark again in another 2.
Not even an hour in Dawson, Bruce.
Kirsten, I just wanted to let you know that the original question I wanted to ask you, but I thought you would faint, was what about birds? Just as a joke.
What about
because we've talked about that before, but I thought that would be rude during the like for reals question period.
Yeah, what about birds? Hillary's interested in birds too.
What about birds? You don't actually have to try to answer because
well, actually I can answer. The preliminary results of our colleagues' bird study are that we're seeing less birds after repeat fires. Don't ask me follow-up questions.
I would never.
Because that's all I got for you, but less songbirds after repeat fires. Uh-oh, Alec, unless it's a question about birds.
No birds.
Okay.
I feel like I definitely have no, like all I know is what you presented today. So it looks like really intensive sampling, local sampling. So I have a question, it's like a pretty classic question, but how, I don't know, like how much would you lose or how different would your results be had you looked at this using, or maybe you also did, but had you looked at this using like remote sensing, like sort of core scale? So what do you think that like we lose going the other way and looking like broadly instead of specific sites? Anyways, maybe you did as well, but, and it's also, not. You did not, okay. Yeah.
What do we lose when we go core scale?
Yeah, or like, how do you feel like, yeah, like obviously there's all of the community stuff, but about those sort of landscapes, maybe it's also.
Yeah, I think, I know like up here above NASA, I'm not sure if you're familiar with like the above program in NASA, but they do all of those flight paths and, you know, and they do sort of ground truth them, etc. So, I mean, I think perhaps logistically, this is the simpler way to go. And for a two-man band, just me and Carissa, this is definitely the easier way to go. But yeah, I think it's important to have the ground truthing and stuff like that. But I also think that it would be interesting if you're able to scale this up or put some of these data into some of those sort of bigger picture models that that NASA and co are doing.
Alec,
Yeah.
we need someone with the MUN Geography GIS certificate to collaborate with who could handily help us with really good R skills as well, would be really useful for that collaboration. Yeah. So
not sure where you find those
any
people.
Free time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really neat. I think that like translation across scales it's hard because you're even collecting very different data. Like there isn't anything, we can't remotely sense spiders. So
yeah, for sure.
Anyways, congrats. Thanks. It's really cool.
Thank you. Thanks, Crystal.
All right, I have another meeting.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Doesn't stop for me. But congratulations, Kirsten. It was so fantastic to end on such a bright note.
Great. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks, Bruce and Megan.
Yeah, I've been struggling to find that paper, so I've just contacted Dan Krause, who made a presentation on it. It's wonderful. So I'll get back to you with the paper about the biological hotspots. So.
Oh, okay, sounds great. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.